you, Anna. Hi, I'm Ophelia Basgal. I'm a consultant fellow at the UC Berkeley Terner Center for Housing Innovation. And what brought me to affordable housing was a graduate internship at UC Berkeley many years ago. And my first internship was at HUD, so the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and that was started my career in housing.
I'll go ahead and chime in next. Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Saber. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing and Local Planning at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is based in the Bay Area. And I first got into housing. I'm actually a lawyer by training, trying to recover from that as best I can these days. My first kind of real job on the ground outside of law school was working as a tenants' rights attorney at a community-based legal services agency. So I kind of come at the affordable housing world very much from kind of a tenant perspective and thinking about housing insecurity, housing instability, and what that can mean for families and communities.
Great, I'll dive in. My name is Barry Roeder, and I work on data and strategic projects for the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. I'll talk a little bit more about my background with one of the digital projects we'll discuss today later. I came to the affordable housing space because I had the good fortune to live out of the country. I lived in Buenos Aires for 6 years. And when I came back to San Francisco, I was struck by the discrepancies that I saw, sort of the wealth gaps. I was struck by six-figure cars driving through areas of the Tenderloin that have $15,000 per capita income. And I thought, wow, this is kind of like the third world. And I decided I needed to change what I was doing, which at the time, my last private sector job was creating a line of credit for high net worth individuals, and I just couldn't get around that anymore. So made a shift.
Thanks, Barry. I can round us out. So my name is Rohan Sethna. I'm a partner at Exygy. I lead our civic sector practice here. Exygy partners with social impact organizations to design and build technology that improves lives. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. We've worked closely with Barry and his team at the city of San Francisco. I came to housing kind of luckily really early on in my career. I did an AmeriCorps stint in Houston as a counselor for first-time home buyers. So I counseled about 30 families a month on anything from credit to, prepping to be a home buyer. Personally, I come from a family of activists on my mother's side. They were freedom fighters in India. And so my personal ethos around what I care about and what I focus on are generally ways to really radically meet basic needs for people and protect civil liberties. And given that, low-income folks, formerly incarcerated folks, Black and Brown families, various groups have a harder time accessing affordable housing, I view it as a civil rights issue, as many of us do. So that's kind of just the lens and my personal background coming to it. Cool. All right. Well, Anna, I think we should dive in. Yeah.
Sounds great.
So we have very little time with you guys. We're going to try and pack in as much as possible. There's a lot of knowledge on this panel that I want everyone to hear from. I'll sort of play a facilitator role and take us through some key questions that will hopefully give you guys a good background and grounding in what's happening in affordable housing. So the first thing I want to do is step back a little bit, and I'm going to ask Ophelia to dive in and give us a little bit of a history lesson in affordable housing. And how you kind of anticipate the current administration fits into that and ground us in where we've come so far.
Great, Rohan, thank you. So this is going to be a very high-level overview of sort of important dates in U.S. housing policy. And we're going to go back almost 90 years ago to the end of the Great Depression, because that was the first major congressional legislative action back in 1934 when we created the Federal Housing Agency, which was focused on home ownership. And coming out of the Depression, that was a big issue. And it was how to make home ownership affordable through a mortgage insurance program. So that was our first program aimed nationally at addressing housing needs. That got followed in 1937 by the U.S. Housing Act, which created public housing, which was the first time we had a program that focused on low-income housing. And it provided financing to develop public housing. And it was focused on slum clearance. Remember, this was at the end of the Depression. and the construction of new housing. So not only were we focused on developing decent, safe, and sanitary housing, but also the other piece of it was an economic driver. It was designed to create jobs, somewhat similar to the situation that we're in today from the pandemic of facing an economic dislocation and how you could use federal programs to address not only social needs, but also economic. Public housing is owned by and operated by local housing authorities that are then subject to federal regulation. Initially, the program focused on families with modest incomes who paid a flat rent to cover the operating expenses of the public housing. But over the years, that has shifted, and the eligibility focus now is on extremely low income and low income families. People now pay rent, families pay rent based on a percent of their income. It originally was 20%, grew over time from 20 to 25, and is currently 30% of adjusted gross income. And that percentage of family income is how we see rent set in most affordable housing programs. The federal government does contribute operating subsidy to offset the fact that the operating costs may exceed the actual rental income that comes in. That program serves just about 1.1 million very low income households. And in 1965, the Department of Housing and Urban Development was created as a cabinet level agency following much of the civil rights legislation that came about. In 1964, we did have a Civil Rights Act that was adopted, and they're specifically called out to prevent discrimination against members of protected classes in private or public housing. That act has been amended over time, but it was a statement that, we did not want to see discrimination in the provision of housing. In the early 1970s, there was some thought that maybe the private sector could do a better job of providing affordable housing than the public sector. And so there were programs developed by the federal government that really focused on nonprofit and for-profit ownership and provided subsidies through low interest loans, tax benefits, and rental subsidies. And those programs went on, some of them still exist, but there was quite a bit of construction that happened between the early 70s until the early 1980s. And there's about 1.4 million households in that program. In 1986, we took a look at the tax code and created the low-income housing tax credit program to provide incentives for the construction of affordable housing. And that is now the largest government subsidy program that we have. In 1974, there was a sea change. Basically, there was research being done that said the problem isn't that there's not a sufficient supply of safe and sanitary housing. The fact is that people just can't afford it. And so there was an experimental program that was created to see if you could provide rental subsidies for low-income families to rent apartments on the private rental market. And it was an experiment that worked. And from that flowed what we call the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher program that we have today. It currently serves 2.2 million households. It is the largest federal subsidy program. It is administered by local housing authorities. And again, rent in this case is calculated at 30% of income for the families who participate, but they do have the option to pay more with their own funds within limits. In the late 80s, the problem of homelessness arose. And so we got the McKinney Act to address homelessness. And that's kind of where we are today. And I think as we discuss, you'll see that many of the issues that were raised when these programs first started have come back full circle, because it isn't the issue of decent, safe, and sanitary necessarily. We have supply problems that maybe we didn't have when some of these programs were created. I think with the new administration, we are going to see a refocus on affordable housing. We're already seeing it with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program as part of the COVID assistance, homeless assistance, reinstatement of fair housing focus. So a shift back to some of the program, the way that it operated for a number of years. Let me just close by saying that the gap between housing needs and rental assistance persists. In the United States, housing assistance is not an entitlement. So even though you may be income eligible to receive the assistance, you won't necessarily get it. And it falls far short of the needs as a consequence. There's about 26 million households in the United States that meet the program income requirements. Less than 20% of them receive housing assistance. So think of it in terms of numbers. For every 100 low-income households receiving assistance, there are another 300 or so that are income eligible, living in substandard living conditions, and getting no assistance. So we have a big challenge to solve. So Roshan, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and I wonder also, Ophelia, if you're able to touch on, I know the Biden administration is proposing to invest more in Section 8 vouchers and vouchers in general. So I'm assuming that that will tackle this gap that you're just mentioning, that there are a lot of folks who are eligible for assistance who are not getting it.
That's absolutely right, Roshan. And there's even some people who are now saying that we should make housing a right, and rather than having it make it an entitlement program. If you're income eligible, you would be eligible to receive assistance.
Yeah, and I know your colleague Carol Galante has kind of also pushed for incorporating it into the tax code so that people kind of automatically get it, which I know is a huge political challenge and would be very hard to do, but something that's essentially an entitlement that comes to you if you're eligible and you don't have to kind of go out and apply for it.
Correct.
Cool. Well, I'm wondering if you can also, before we get into some of the things that we're seeing, highlight some of the biggest pain points in the current affordable housing landscape and the big buckets that we generally look at for where's innovation happening, where are we pushing, where do we need to reinvest?
Yeah, so I mean, most of it's around cost, which flows from a number of things: land use policies, construction costs, time delays in terms of processing. So we have a real cost problem. When you're building units that are ending up costing $500,000 to $600,000 a unit, it's very hard to make those affordable without enormous amounts of subsidy. And because of the way the programs work, we have many layers of assistance. So, there's no affordable housing development that's done that doesn't involve stacks of different types of financing. And so that's one of the challenges that, clearly the cost issue is a huge one.
Yeah. Barry and Daniel, I'd love to invite you as well. Any challenges you see in the affordable housing landscape right now?
Yeah, sure. I'd underscore what Ophelia said, and I think the key thing is there's a lot of stuff driving costs. And so one of the big ones that we've been kind of looking at recently is land use. But housing is traditionally a very localized concern. Decisions about what gets built where, how big, what does it look like, et cetera, typically done, at least in this country, by local governments. And there's just a lot of barriers there, kind of at the local level, that are written into local rules, whether it's zoning codes, their general plans, permitting processes, et cetera. I think that's just a huge pain point that we're seeing in terms of actually delivering new housing. I would also flag, and I think this is related because the rules are always written the way they are for a reason, which is, political will. Even if you had, because most of these projects tend to get approved by political bodies, you could have the land, you could even have the money, but if you can't get an approval at a local level, you still don't have homes for folks. And so I think just also trying to, that's a major pain point in some locations. It's not kind of true all the way across the board, but certainly having actual political support for housing in a range of housing solutions that meet the needs of everyone in the community, that oftentimes is a major challenge in a lot of locations.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Barry, go ahead.
No, I think the only thing I'd add is that, and my colleagues are well aware of this, but if you sort of take that out another layer, that we need to look at this with a regional lens increasingly. It's hard to manage some of these projects within the context of the individual jurisdictions, and especially when, neighboring jurisdictions have different policies and different approaches. There's certainly an economy of scale that could happen, I think, by sort of looking at these problems in a larger sense. But it's also a way of sort of facilitating things for the housing seeker who it's very hard for them to sort of figure out what's available and where. And as I think we all know, many households are bi-jurisdictional, if you will. They work in one place and live in another. And it's not that they're necessarily just concerned about housing, in their immediate suburb, if you will.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, I know Daniel and Ophelia, you both kind of touched on land use and zoning. I wonder if you could dig in a little bit more there to help us understand what types of zoning laws are blockers or cities that have kind of been shifting that. Maybe Ophelia.
Do you want to take the lead, Ophelia? Yeah.
Well, I'll let you go, Dan. You go first because I think you have some interesting regional approaches that are occurring. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, yeah, so, we're having this panel now, a major topic of conversation at the national level, but then also really is picking up a lot regionally here in the Bay Area, is discussion of single family zoning. And so, a lot of new affordable housing that's getting built, because of all the cost concerns, it only really works at a certain scale. And so you need to be able to build multiple units, and there's just really limited land in a lot of urban America where you're allowed to build more than one unit. And so, we could have a whole separate panel on kind of the history of single family zoning and kind of its impact on the housing market. There's like a very strong racist history to that policy. And I think, that said, it is a complex issue. Local communities still do have a lot of knowledge about where certain things may or may not be appropriate. So I think it is a fine balance, but we're certainly seeing, a number of cities across the country have started to try to eliminate single family zoning. A couple Bay Area cities are talking about that. That is a major shift, and if that trend continues, that would be a huge shift in land use policy at the local level. That could pay, really great dividends for affordable housing. I think one of the complications that we're hearing in a lot of places is that there could potentially be some downside for poor people if you don't do that very carefully. So if you change zoning and you increase land value in a place where poor people already live, that could actually increase displacement pressures. And you may end up pushing out the very people who are meant to benefit from the policy. And so I want to appreciate the fact that it can be nuanced, and I think trying to figure out how to thread that needle, where we can open up opportunities for new homes in communities where there haven't previously been opportunity to build, while doing so in a way that helps get in front of gentrification and displacement concerns. I think that's a kind of key area for policy innovation in the near term.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think Daniel mentioned political will earlier, because people, in neighborhoods automatically think, oh my God, my neighborhood will be overrun by all these apartments and there won't be any place to park, and on and on and on and on. And, historically, the density in single family housing was substantially higher than it is today. I'm a prime example. I'm living in a house that, we met the people who built it back in 1924, and there were 6 people living in the house at that time. There are 2 of us here now. And so, a part of it is giving people the history of, wait a minute, it isn't quite what you think it's going to be. And I think as we do accessory dwelling units and, a number of different initiatives that are out there, the single family zoning, people will see that it doesn't have the negative impact that they're expecting.
Yeah, and having spent a lot of time working in suburbs in the Bay Area, I think the big fear is like suddenly kind of more neighborhood focused is going to look like Manhattan, and I think that's a big concern. And I think lots of times when folks in the business are talking about changing single family zoning, they're not talking about that kind of dramatic swing. So I do think kind of having nuance and allowing for multiple paths forward, I think is one of the ways that we can also try to address the potential political challenges.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to shift us to some of the areas where we're seeing, I guess we don't like to call it innovation, because Daniel has pointed out that there are a lot of things we know we need to do already to support affordable housing development and preservation. But there's, room for both innovation and kind of things we know we already need to do. So I might turn it over to Daniel to talk a little bit about what's happening on kind of the more institutional and policy side, especially here in Northern California, and maybe potentially being a model for the rest of the country.
Yeah, I'd happy to chime in here. So when I introduce myself, I work at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, but if you see my little tag here under my name, it also has /BAFA. What is that? So one of the things that our agency is working to launch is a new institution, which is called the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And so this is a brand new entity created in the 9-county Bay Area in Northern California to act as a regional hub for housing finance policy and support. So this entity was created by state statute in 2019. It kind of sprang into existence January 1st, 2020, just in time to start learning how to walk in the middle of COVID. So, we're facing our challenges like many others. But, the vision for BAFA, this new Housing Finance Authority, is really to elevate the resources and support that are available to move housing in a multi-pronged approach. So at the center of BAFA, and I think this is one of the innovations, the kind of institutional innovation, is that though its name is the Housing Finance Authority, the mandate is much broader than housing finance. So I think we do see housing finance authorities that exist all over the place. BAFA is rooted in what we call the 3 Ps. So production of new housing, preservation of housing, and protecting existing residents. And so BAFA is charged with trying to figure out how we can bring resources to the table to do all of those at the same time. And I think also try to help address the kind of political challenges of working across jurisdictions. There's 109 different jurisdictions in the 9-county Bay Area, each of which has land use authority over its particular plot of land. And so the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority does not have land use authority. We can't say build this here, don't build that there. So we're going to be needing to work in close partnership with our local jurisdictions to try to move the needle. And so creating this regional infrastructure, I think, is a really interesting institutional innovation. It's the first of its kind in California. I don't think many things like it exist in the United States at all. And we're really excited about that. As you said, though, Roshan, sometimes we need to innovate in certain places because what we have been doing isn't working clearly, based on the need that's still out there in the community. But there are some things where we do know the answer, and like to build affordable housing, you do just need subsidy. You need resources, that's not rocket science. In the current economy, as Ophelia laid out, like one of the issues is just people can't afford housing. And so there needs to be subsidy there. And so, there's innovation we can try to bring to bringing together different financing mechanisms so that they're more sensible, cohesive, and, result in less delay and kind of professional costs associated with building affordable housing. The other thing BAFA can do that's, not rocket science is just bring in more money. BAFA has the power to place a revenue measure on the ballot for all the counties in the 9-county Bay Area to just raise more revenue. And so that's something that we're going to be evaluating in the coming years to just try to increase the size of the pie so that people who are doing great work right now have more resources to have greater impact in that work.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of government and institutional investments in housing. I know there's also private sector solutions that have popped up, which are also really interesting to follow, which also involve coalitions. I mean, I think we're seeing this theme of a lot of coalition building to work on affordable housing together. So, in LA and in other parts of the country, there are these models where you will have a funder come together. Kaiser has been one of these really popular funders because they see housing as a social determinant of health. And you'll have a developer, and then you'll usually have community groups, whether that's in LA, for example, it's been churches that have come together to say, hey, we have land, we want to make use of it, we want to build on it. And these kind of coalitions are financing and building permanently affordable housing outside of government kind of funding structures. So I think we kind of need innovation in what you could kind of call the private sector as well as on the government side as well. Well, I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about kind of a more end user focus. How are we focusing on designing and building for housing applicants themselves and considering their experiences in the process and in obtaining housing? And Barry, maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience in that. Barry and I've had the fortune of working on a project in the Bay Area, Northern California, that has been very user-centric and iterative and built out over time. And he can kind of give some background there.
Yeah, thanks, Roshan. Yeah, from the perspective of the housing seeker, and I sort of made brief reference to this before, it's been really difficult. So as other panelists have noted, there's definitely been a shortage of opportunity. But even if those opportunities are out there, the question is sort of how do you find out about them? And it's been, I think, sort of shockingly random. It's like, well, I happen to know someone who happens to see, or I was walking down a street and I saw a sign. And then even from there, it's sort of, well, I went through the process, I created an application, which could traditionally be somewhat cumbersome, 12 or 15 pages, and might even include things like tax returns and pay stubs and things like that. And you would submit it, and then it's kind of in a black box and you don't even hear about it. Or let's say you're really lucky and you heard about 2 opportunities. The second opportunity might not accept the paperwork that you prepared for the first opportunity. So it's really like, wow. And you think about that in any other context, it's not really a great value proposition, if you will. So what I've been fortunate to work on with MoCD and with the city of San Francisco has been, we think, a groundbreaking system that we
Barry, what's MoCD?
I'm sorry, thank you very much. The Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. Thank you very much for that here in San Francisco. A groundbreaking system called Dahlia, and that's, you'll see here that there's a public sector requirement to create acronyms. So that's why we do that. We have a quota, sorry about that. So Dahlia is the database of affordable housing listings, information, and application. It's the San Francisco flower. Basically, it's our housing portal. So you can go to one place and see what's currently available, and you can apply for it in short order in 15 minutes. To create that, though, we had to really adopt some different practices in terms of project management. In short, it couldn't be well, let's create the big binder of requirements, and then we'll go off in a corner and work on them for a while. The risk of that with most technology projects, as we learned from our early partners, Google, and our fantastic partner Exygy along the way, is if you're not tied with the users sort of lockstep in the process, you might go build that binder and then you come and no one's there. It doesn't work for them. It doesn't make sense to them. They don't use it. To date, we've had over 5 million site visits and 600,000 applications. So we've got a lot of traction, which is great. But I'll tell you one other thing that's sort of been interesting is that we've learned along the way that while we thought we were building something for our users, and we did, again, to make it easier to find and apply for affordable housing, because it's a digital product, we're amassing a lot of data on who's looking at what, and realizing, well, wait a second, why are we building those things when people are looking for that? It's this incredibly powerful tool that we didn't have before. But Roshan, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too, because of course the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development has learned how to do things agilely and how to learn how to be user-centric based on the things we learned from you guys.
Well, I appreciate that we've been able to have this partnership for now 5+ years. And I actually think you hit on what to me is the bigger value out of the project, is that the institution, being the Mayor's Office of Housing, has learned new ways of working. I think often as a design and tech agency, people kind of come to us and say, hey, can you build this or build that? And it's going to help us be this silver bullet to solve this really complex kind of ecosystem level problem. So the way I like to usually reframe it with our clients in housing and in other sectors is just using product as kind of that lever for change. And so the development process for a digital product, in your case, this affordable housing platform called Dahlia, centers users, it starts small, releases early, iterates and builds on it. That process, I think, is intriguing, and we need more of that in the public sector. I think before Dahlia, and what has now become an open source tool that multiple jurisdictions are using for affordable housing management, jurisdictions weren't really building tools that were backed by a lot of user research or being iteratively built out over time. One example of this is that, in the previous experience, end users would have to go to different buildings, pick up an application that was specific for each building, right? And you have to make sure you have the right application and things like that. Now through this process, there's kind of one common application in the Bay Area for affordable housing that we're working towards. So we center users, we center and design what works for them. At a broader scale, I think, previous to this product, we had no formal collaboration between multiple Bay Area jurisdictions on housing. We weren't talking about, to your point about data, like how do bond measures kind of use data that's coming out of this product to say, how do we need to invest? Where do we need to invest? That was kind of an idea of one of the jurisdictions had. And then ultimately, since we're building this housing tool as an open source tool, how do we share resources to, maintain it and share costs? So I think what the platform or this digital website has caused is more systemic organizational change in how we build and deliver services. and how do we, use a platform as a way to have these conversations. I think it's really brought together a lot of different groups, whether they're counties, cities, housing developers, housing counselors, housing seekers. We've done a really good job of bringing a bunch of different groups around the table. So what Barry mentioned, the Dahlia product can be found at housing.sfgov.org. So that's the platform that housing seekers in the city and county of San Francisco can use to search and apply for affordable housing. That product was abstracted because we had the foresight to say, hey, let's build this in open source code. So we were able to then abstract it to say, hey, here's a website that any jurisdiction can use to kind of manage and deliver their affordable housing. And so that abstracted product is called Bloom Housing, and it's being implemented in a few different Bay Area jurisdictions. And we're starting to kind of create this coalition to have a regional collaboration that Barry's leading. What we like to kind of call it, Exygy, is in the product world, we say minimum viable product. It's like the first thing you release that provides value to people. But my colleagues and I like to kind of say minimum viable community. So like, what's that minimum viable group of people that you had to get together to, have more systemic change? And then, the last thing I'll say is that, I think layering on, whether it's technology or data collection or whatever it is, onto like poor policy or ineffective institutions or things like that doesn't really do us any good. So I think this interplay with like institutions moving forward and digital services moving forward in sync is really important. Digital products, I think, can show people where a policy or program isn't working or isn't having its intended impact, but then there kind of needs to be that feedback loop back to policy or program leaders to say, okay, we have to shift something now. It's not kind of working the way we thought it was going to. And then I just wanted to, I know I mentioned the kind of more private sector initiatives with Kaiser Investing. If anyone does want to look those up, Strategic Development Solutions is the folks pulling together the fund that Kaiser is investing in, specifically in LA, if people are interested in more of kind of the private sector side.
Roshan, if I could, I mean, I think there's a spectrum to what we're talking about. I mean, from the things we already know how to do that Daniel mentioned to, a process like Dahlia, I think one area that's really ripe for significant changes in the construction industry itself. We're seeing the development of modular housing in the United States and more product and, techniques that, we've been building the same way, stick-built housing for the last, 70, 80 years. And this is a real shift that will help address some of the issues around cost and time and construction and help bring that cost down. So, it ranges all the way. And that modular couldn't have happened without sort of technology that's come along with it. So.
Yeah. Any final thoughts before we open it up to questions from the panelists?
I do want to just know, I noticed that one person did say, is this pretty much just focused on California? We're obviously all in the Bay Area, so that is kind of the lens a little bit, but I do want to say that the issues we face here are no different than high cost areas across the country. And, there are solutions that I think are relevant all across, the various different jurisdictions.
There was a great article in the New York Times about a week or two ago saying, is California exporting its affordability crisis? There's, a lot of news about Californians leaving because of the high cost, but the point of the article was really, these issues do exist, at least in the US, and many of our major metropolitan areas. And so I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And certainly, at the kind of the regional government in Northern California, we're interested in learning from and seeing how we can be in dialogue with other regions that are trying to take on really similar issues.
Thanks to both of you. I think I would just love to add to that, I'm really hopeful that things like the Dahlia platform in San Francisco or the Bloom platform regionally can, as we talked about, take data that helps us make a better argument for why we need to do this. Should this become an entitlement? How do we support? And I think that data can do things, sort of create the minimum viable community, as you mentioned, Roshan, sort of gather us around this, so we have a better understanding of who are the people that are struggling with housing? And in San Francisco, I mean, I know, you know, it's easy to say, you know, the poor people, but it's actually quite a number of economic segments that are struggling with housing. And I'm sorry if we're exporting that to the rest of the country. But it is a conversation we need to have. And I think that the data that we can gather from some of these technology innovations might help us.
I would just tack onto that as one other thought, that I love the part about the data and also really engaging the user. Like the idea that the folks who stand to benefit from these investments and policies should be involved in actually shaping how we do this, I think is an idea that has a lot of currency in kind of the social justice space generally. And I do think that that is something that kind of in the policy making space, we need to keep kind of going back to that, that, you know, if we're going to be proposing solutions for struggles that so many people are facing, we really need to be in close contact with them to make sure we understand the contours of those issues, understand that are the solutions we're putting forward really working? Are they suggesting solutions and we need to just listen to them? And there's not a lot of innovation we need to do. It's really just a matter of like understanding what people are asking for and providing that as government. You know, I think that's the kind of thing that the private sector, you know, has learned to do. And I think government tries to do that, but that is a place where we can always improve.
Great. Well, I might move us to some of the questions that are coming in. So we had one from Chloe. Has there been any consideration for how to adjust for the rising costs of materials for housing? I've heard multiple developers cite this as a barrier to build more affordable housing. I know, Daniel, you mentioned kind of the density is important when, you know, needing to keep costs down. Are there any other solutions out there that we're seeing for rising costs?
Dahlia, do you want to take that? I think you've got.
Let me just weigh in on that quickly. Is that, you know, there are, as I mentioned, the modular housing where you're building off-site, you have much less construction waste, so that addresses the materials cost. Also, the materials that people are using themselves. There's an architectural professor at Berkeley that is doing 3D printed houses. And I mean, you know, they're small right now, but, you know, I think there's opportunities, and, you know, just the issues of concrete and its in making concrete and its impact and cement on climate change. You know, so we're going to need to continue to look at product, no question about it. And I think that, you know, bringing some of the steel manufacturing back into the United States will probably help some. So there's kind of a range of policies that address that issue around construction costs associated with materials.
Great. Yeah, I know, Mark, you said a similar question about that as well. There's a question in the chat that's also related to Dahlia specifically. So I don't know, Barry, if you could maybe address this. For any public sector housing folks on the line, could you maybe explain San Francisco's interest in building Dahlia vis-a-vis what was the targeted difference in functionality between Dahlia and other systems like Rent Cafe?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. So first of all, maybe just when we started the process, Rent Cafe wasn't there. And just for the folks that don't know, that's a product that's offered by Yardi. Yardi is a system of record for housing agencies. There's a few of them that housing agencies and developers use. Yardi is arguably the most well-known. So Rent Cafe is an opportunity for people to sort of, those agencies and or developers to put up a listing about their information. What we found, first of all, those weren't there when we started our process, but what we discovered was that they tend to have less functionality in a couple key regards. One is you'll find that there are a number of sort of, for lack of a better term, listing services that would provide information about sort of what's currently available, or they might even give availability information. They'll just sort of, our portfolio is this. If you want more information, click here. But as you go further down the path of what a housing seeker would need, like, well, the next application, there are fewer that have application. And next, sort of tools for the housing agency and developer to manage the placement process, it sort of becomes thinner and thinner. And then the other thing too, candidly, for better or worse, is that a number of those portals that don't originate from or interact directly with the jurisdiction don't have access to the information and processes required to actually process an application all the way through to placement. So for instance, they might not manage a housing lottery preference programs that would be there, or things like that. So aside from the fact that Rent Cafe specifically didn't exist when we started our process, I don't think we would say, oh, shoot, we should have used Rent Cafe, because we just recognize all the other pieces that are involved. And so that's why we've decided to sort of go a custom route, if you will. But I want to hasten to sort of define that term. That does not mean we're going to build our own thing and we're not going to share it, or worse, we're building it with a partner who claims it as their own intellectual property. And if tomorrow they don't want to do something, or maybe they go out of business and, oh my goodness, what do we do? That's this, I think, this wonderful idea about open source. In a technology segment, open source, I mean, I think sometimes they're sort of, hey, it's open source, let's go to lunch. Like, not, what does that really mean? But the idea is, no, this lives in the public sector for the benefit of the public sector. And none of us are hijacked by what it is, and we can collaborate on the pieces that we want. That's what we're working on in the Bay Area, so we can share costs, great. But hey, as San Francisco, I need some special pieces. Okay, fine, I can build that code on top. I just think there's a wonderful flexibility and modularity that will create efficiencies at the same time that it allows us to serve our unique needs.
Yeah, it's a good point, Barry. I think there's been this push in civic technology to say, okay, here's the portal where you can apply to all your benefits, or here's the portal where you can, and it inevitably there needs to be some customization at the local level. So to your point, yeah, Bloom Housing is a piece of open source code, and Dahlia as well. The San Francisco site is a piece of open source code, is available for any jurisdiction right now to take and implement if you have, engineers and designers in-house to do that. Ophelia, I saw you unmuted. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in here.
Oh, that's okay. That's
Okay,
fine.
cool. Let's see, we have maybe a few more minutes. Let's see what other questions we have. We have one question about what extent are housing plans being blended with improved educational and employment opportunities. I wonder, Ophelia, you're nodding. If you want to speak to that, I'm happy to also speak to it.
Yeah, on the one right below it about housing becoming a right, I mean, some of this, it sort of interrelates. In terms of affordable housing policies, I think equity has risen to the top, which was not necessarily a consideration before, and it specifically gets to the issues of what we now call neighborhoods of opportunity, is looking at where we're siting housing. It used to just be, is there shopping in the neighborhood, whatever. We're now looking more broadly. So is there, in fact, what do the school, the test scores show? What other kinds of services are in the community? That does not mean that you can't develop services and, issues that would address services and other things that would help address issues of inequity in communities that may not be so richly sourced. But I think there definitely is a bigger focus now on looking at those kind of metrics. It's not enough just to build decent, safe, and sanitary housing in an island where people end up separated out from the rest of the community and don't benefit from the values there. And then in terms of just the question about who's writing more deeply on the notion of housing becoming the right, you'll see a lot of that in the advocacy groups like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the National Low Income Housing, and there's a fair amount of research going on and what the cost would look like. So those might be some resources to check out.
Yeah, and I know this notion of, we, at least on the homelessness end, we've been kind of talking more about kind of low and middle income housing, but on the homelessness end, we've historically said like, okay, well, you need to be clean to get this housing, or you need to have all these requirements to get this housing. And I think we've shifted a lot of that thinking to being a housing first approach, as it's called. So, you get housing, and no matter what, we're not putting, restrictions or qualifications on it. And actually that housing also has wraparound services and other things that come with it. So a lot of the, nonprofit housing developers have more of those kind of services in-house and where they're building. We can see more and more of that on that side. The for-profit developers obviously don't as much because they don't play in that space, but a lot of for-profit developers in San Francisco do build pieces of the affordable housing stock here because of San Francisco policy that requires them to. Let's see. We also have a question about metrics. What are key metric? Oh yeah, did someone want to jump in? Daniel?
I was going to jump in on a different question.
Yeah, jump in. There's a lot of great ones.
There was one question, yeah, that was coming up in the Q&A part about kind of saying, what are the panelists' thoughts on the concept of focusing production on neighborhoods of opportunity versus other areas where there may be need but aren't kind of considered high opportunity areas? And so this is a big question in the world of fair housing and kind of civil rights within the United States, kind of all across the country. And I think I don't have a specific answer to this, but maybe a framework of thinking about it. One is that there's an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. That's a federal rule that's kind of been tossed around back and forth during the last couple of years with administration change. Here in California, we have a statewide version of that rule. And I think that rule may give us a bit of a framework to think about how to try to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I guess one thing I would put out is when I hear this question, sometimes when I hear the debate, it's like, well, do we either invest in these areas of opportunity that are high resource with great schools and parks and walkable and so on, and build low income housing there so that poor people can live in places where there's great opportunity? That feels really important. And there's lower income communities and communities of color that have been historically disinvested in. And so how do we make sure that we're focusing public resources to benefit those people that historically have really been left on the sidelines? And those, with limited dollars, right, we got to try to find an approach about how to do both. And I think the idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing helps a little bit because it really says you got to do both. You really need to open up opportunity for people who have been left out in those places where there is opportunity. And then we also need to figure out how to invest in places to transform them into places of opportunity. So it's not just about investing in affordable housing in lower income neighborhoods and communities of color because there's such need there. It's also about bringing other investments that can really transform those neighborhoods. What I would say is with this approach, I think you need to have really tailored policy packages that accompany them in different scenarios. So you don't want to suddenly invest a ton of public money in a low income community without having strong tenant protections in place, because then you may just displace out everybody with the increase in land values and attractiveness, and kind of the free market just like runs rampant over those folks. And you tried to improve their neighborhood for them and suddenly they're not there anymore. So, I think if we can do both, and when we're doing both, we also need to be clear-eyed that it's not just a one-size-fits-all, every community gets the same set of investments and policies. We need to really tailor them to be appropriate to the local context. So I really appreciate that question, because I think that's a place where we need to do better thinking collectively as a housing sector to figure out how to do both of those well.
I'm really intrigued by the question that was Candida, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, posted about, what do we do to control rising costs? I mean, part of what, Daniel mentioned earlier, some of the things we know time is money in construction of housing. So there was a recent study done on a project that was done in San Francisco with very specific timeframes to get it in and out of the door in terms of permitting, et cetera, and you can see the cost reduction. But the other issue that I think people are starting to look at is, should we take into account what's the risk to the housing developer in terms of the amount of subsidy that we're providing? Some of these subsidies are in fact very rich when there's very little risk to the developer themselves. And so I think we probably need to somehow tweak the formula so that takes into account that risk-based factor. So the cost of the money ends up, you can drive it down unless there's associated risk with it.
Great. Well, I know we're wrapping up in a few minutes. Any final thoughts from the panelists or questions you didn't get to answer? I know we didn't get to every single question, so we'll try and answer some of them as follow-ups if we're able to as a group.
I just want to say that I'm grateful to be part of this conversation and grateful to have all of you as attendees be part of the conversation, and we'd like to continue the conversation. We as panelists had a chance to chat about this, and we thought, oh my gosh, we'd love to keep talking about this and keep talking about it with you. So please, reach out to us. I think that Anna will provide that information, and send us an email if there's let's keep the conversation going. I think these are very important discussions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Barry. We at Exygy, we really want to view this as a series on housing. So this was the first of many and kind of a primer. In the survey that Anna's sending you, we definitely want to hear if there's topics you want to dive deeper into, because I think all the panelists mentioned there's specific topics that we just brushed on for 60 seconds that we could have a whole panel on. So we're happy to kind of set those up in the future if that is interesting for folks. Rita says yes, please do more. Anna, you want to wrap us up?
Yes, thank you. I will after I unmute myself. So thank you all. Hopefully you can, oops, sharing screen is paused. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So as Roshan said, we did have a number of great questions that didn't get answers, but I have copied all of them and we will email you some of the panel's responses to those in a follow-up email. In addition, in that email will be the recording to this event. So you can save it, it'll be on YouTube, you can share it, all of the things. Additionally, our panel, as Barry said, really wants to continue this conversation with all of you outside of this 1 hour. So they have graciously included their contact information, which you can see on the right side of the screen. So feel free to contact them individually if you had questions for these awesome folks. And then lastly, yeah, this is an event series. And so the best way to find out about the next event is to join Exygy's Bloom Housing newsletter, and that's at housing.exygy.com. We would love to have you there. It's a great community of folks who are all working on affordable housing. So I think that does it for us. I think we'll start to wrap up. Thank you all for joining. We really appreciated this conversation. It's a really critical time, and we hope to have more in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very much. Take care, y'all.
take care.
Bye-bye.